This is PolarisLive. I'm your host, Sarwar Kashmiri, welcoming our viewers from around the world to this global dialogue on the US-China relationship and its impact in the world. This program brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Our guest today is Professor Gregory Chin, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at York University, Toronto, Canada, and Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He served as a diplomat in the Canadian Embassy in Beijing, responsible for Canadian foreign aid to China and North Korea. His research on China, the Asian region, and world order started in the early 1990s and spans four decades. So please welcome at PolarisLive, Professor Gregory Chin. Good morning, Professor Chin. My deep and sincere apologies for this technology which went awry.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Sawar. Absolutely no worries. Happy to be with you.
Well, listen, thank you for your patience. And you are in Toronto.
Yeah.
What is it like out there this morning?
Yeah, a little bit of snow. It's a little cold, just below zero. So I'm in the outskirts of Toronto in an area called Caledon. Very nice. A lot of nature around me. And so, yeah, it's very nice. Thank you. And I hope all is well with you, where you
All
are.
is well here. I'm in the slightly less frigid confines of Hanover, New Hampshire. And so isn't this technology wonderful when it works?
When it works, it's beautiful, as we say when we're teaching, too.
Listen, let me once again just apologize to our viewers for this technological glitch. But it is really, given the headlines today, a real pleasure for us at PolarisLive to have Professor Gregory Chin. Gregory Chin, let me start off by asking you that to punish China for its actions in Hong Kong, the US applied financial sanctions on Hong Kong and the People's Republic of China and their officials. Now, you've written that these actions actually did the reverse, increased fund inflows into Hong Kong and created a surge in demand for the shares of the sanctioned Chinese firms in Hong Kong and the mainland's the stock markets. So how can this be? I mean, 90% of the world trade is in US dollars. Please explain.
That's a great question. Thank you, Sawar. I think part of what I've been looking at here is my concern about the United States' growing use of financial statecraft, financial sanctions, and you could almost call economic warfare measures, and now turned on to China and Hong Kong. And we know that these patterns have been intensifying over the last decade plus, and 2 decades actually. But the China dimension, where China's been the receiving end directly, this is something new. China has been impacted kind of indirectly up until now, largely when U.S. sanctions were placed on North Korea or Iran, Russia, others that China has relations with. But now we're seeing them directly being put onto China again. Of course, we harken back to the Cold War. U.S. had sanctions on China during the Cold War, of course. But now in this new era, we see these measures. And I think what's quite interesting about the impact, when you look at the impact of the U.S. financial sanctions, is that the unintended consequences outweigh whatever intended consequences behind this policy. In other words, yes, these sanctions placed on Hong Kong, but also at the same time, the other measures about forcing the delisting of Chinese companies off of U.S. stock exchanges, and also investment bans on U.S. investment bans on Chinese companies that are purported to be linked to the Chinese military. This combination of measures, in conjunction with the measures in regard to Hong Kong, is, it has led to some capital outflows as far as U.S. assets and holdings in Hong Kong. However, the inflows have far outweighed the outflows. Inflows from Europe, inflows from other parts of Asia, inflows from the mainland into Hong Kong.
But let me just, sorry for interrupting, but I want to just touch on this point you've made. I mean, American allies in the West, right, generally follow America. And then, as I mentioned earlier, 90% more of world trade is done in US dollars. So how can it be that this reverse take place? What's accounting for it? Because it seems to me this is really important to understand why American policy is failing in this respect.
Sure.
And as an American, that bothers me. So can you just touch on that point, please?
Yeah, I think part of the issue here is, when you look at global financial markets and financial markets, it's looking to see, where are the returns, where, fairly stable investment opportunities. And so what global investors feel is that those Chinese assets, or the assets that are listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, are actually worth investing in. So the fundamentals are quite strong. They see the investment potential. And so even though the United States, may have the ability, the US government may have the ability to affect the US asset managers, there are other asset managers around the world, and they may not be as sensitive, obviously, to US policy, US government policy. So I think that helps explain, that's market fundamentals. Money flows in, money flows out. And that Hong Kong's resiliency as an international financial center, a lot of those advantages that Hong Kong has still are there. Obviously, there have been street demonstrations and national security law and some degree of uncertainty about what that all means as far as the legal system and rights and things of that nature. However, from the investment standpoint, the reputation of Hong Kong as a well-managed financial center still is pretty strong, still very strong. And so, in what we've seen, in fact, the rate of IPOs have gone up, in the last 2-3 years. So in that regard, I think what, in part, Washington, I don't know if they fully comprehend, is that, China is no longer just like the world's factory and, a trade superpower. It is also becoming a financial power. And the financial centers of Shanghai, Hong Kong, and others, they carry a certain attraction to them.
Well, I think it's fascinating what you've just said, and I think terribly important, because I was reading just 2 or 3 days ago that the property market, the real estate market in Hong Kong today is probably at the highest level that it's ever been. Thousands of dollars per square foot for small, tiny apartments. And so the reason I'm belaboring this point, Gregory Chen, is because might it be that we don't fully understand, as you've said, that this policy is not going to work as effectively anymore against China, because it is, by some measures, the largest economy in the world, and perhaps it's hurting America more than China. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. I think that China is showing itself to have a certain resiliency, as we can see through COVID and through the global financial crisis earlier. There's a certain resiliency built that China has built up now, and there's even a lot of domestic consumption levers that they haven't, really, kind of utilized if they need to.
Right.
And so this is where I think there is a certain degree of autonomy that China has been able to now create, and included in that is, its main trading partners. In the last decade, China has diversified. Europe is the key trading partner. Asia, East Asia, key trading partner. U.S. has fallen to number 3 in the world for China as trading partners. So this is where, obviously, Africa, China's done a lot in Africa, even Latin America. And so in some ways, it's kind of North America that is somewhat marginal to some degree, although of course we know U.S.-China relations are very important. There's enormous interdependence. But as far as, that's kind of the story of the last 40 years, the U.S.-China. but the story of the last decade is China diversifying, right? And so I think you're absolutely right. There are these new elements to the China story that not everyone's wrapped their heads around.
Well, it's interesting. I was watching an interview with Dr. Henry Kissinger a few days ago, and he seemed quite dismayed that the China hawks in the Washington establishment have taken over driving this relationship. And he basically said that that is a mistake and that we really need to sit back and think about it. And I was quite struck because he is obviously the guy with President Nixon, Dr. Kissinger, who opened up China and is considered the wise man when it comes to China, Asia, US relations. And so what I'm asking you now is, Asia seems to be the driver of change increasingly, right? Do you think that in the West, there is this understanding of Asia as to how it's driving, the demand for luxury goods, creating infrastructure, smart cities? Are we paying enough attention, you believe, you think, to Asia? China, yes, but Asia?
I think we are paying attention to Asia from North America, whether it's US and Canada, but unfortunately, mainly as a kind of threat. Right? Whether it's China threat or whether it's Asia's rise is affecting the income or jobs of people in North America. It's understandable. Globalization has had a major impact on many strata in the United States. Right? There has been job loss as America has lost some of the contest with Asia in the context of globalization. But what we haven't wrapped our heads around and I think developed proactive strategy is how to respond to Asia's rise as an opportunity and where it can help sharpen our competitiveness and our productivity, our innovativeness. I think the Obama administration is trying to do some of that. The Biden administration with its new infrastructure package and spending plans. But I think, yes, absolutely so are. I think other parts of the world have been much more attuned and responsive to the rise of Asia or the BRICS. If you look, for example, with the new development bank that the BRICS have created recently, Uruguay, United Arab Emirates, and Bangladesh have joined this NDB. And if you look at the statements of why Uruguay joined, Uruguay from South America, they said part of the reason is because everything new in the world seems to be coming from Asia, and therefore the need to respond to that.
So interesting.
Right? I don't think in North America we're quite attuned to this. We're trying to protect our privileged position in the world, and maintain our quality of life. But the protection is leading to protectionism and insularity, as I think your question is hinting at.
Well, listen, you have a real advantage over a lot of us, which is that you're not just a well-known academia person, but you have actually spent time in Canada's diplomatic service. You've been posted to Beijing. You've been involved in aid to both China and Mongolia. So let me ask you, what does China want? Does China want to create a whole new world order with it at its center? I mean, that's a question which people here ask all the time. Anyway, what does China want?
That's a great question. It's the $1 million question that we're all trying to answer. And I think China isn't being totally clear on what China wants. And part of that is because I think China is also kind of groping to figure out, as they say, crossing the river by feeling stones. China is also trying to figure this through. So there's a certain amount of muddling through. At the same time, there's also some strategic direction. I think China clearly would like to retake what it considers its rightful place in the world, which is one of the great powers in the world. But at the same time, I think China is trying to do so in a way that doesn't just replicate previous patterns. So whether it was British imperialism or world wars, one or two, or even the Soviet Union, its efforts. I I think China's trying to do it differently. And I think most important, though, is to keep in mind that for China's leaders, I think for Xi Jinping, I don't claim to know what's in the mind of Xi Jinping, but there are certain structural dimensions that always press upon Chinese leaders. And the first one is when you wake up every morning, you have to worry about 1.4 billion people. How make sure everyone's fed, make sure everyone's taken care of, make sure the country's holding together. And I think that's the overriding concern of the Chinese leaders, is to ensure that China maintains its national stability and integrity. But as China's been doing that, of course, we know the last 5 decades, China has been more and more integrated with the global economy and the world. And so China's leaders now also, in order to maintain China's rise and continued modernization and development, they are now engaging more and more in the world, and their global footprint is expanding. The challenge for China is, as you say, what's the end game? Does China says it wants to do so peacefully, and it wants to do so in a positive and constructive way. And I hope China succeeds at that. I think we would all hope China succeeds at that.
Right.
The challenge for China is, though, at the same time, the world runs along market kind of conditions, and there's some degree of competition and rivalry, and you have to compete within the markets. And so China then also has to compete. And fortunately, China, I think, actually does understand markets. This is where the Chinese civilization has had markets for a long, long time.
Indeed.
So Chinese get markets.
Indeed.
And so, sorry if I haven't given you a more precise answer on that. But I think part of this is China's also muddling its way through. And my sense, though, is China from history knows it doesn't want to be like a tiger alone at the top of the mountain. If you're that, they're always going to be coming. Others always going to be coming for you.
Do you think we can learn some things? Does history tell us anything about this transition? I mean, 15th century and so on, the Dutch were in the position that China is now, right? The world revolved around Holland, and the guilder was everyone came to invest there, and then they transitioned out and Britain transitioned in. And then Britain was there for a while, and then America transitioned in. And I wonder, in that intermediate period, whether the difficulty of absorbing that one is not number one anymore gives rise to this turbulence for a number of years. Do you think there's anything in that we can learn from?
Absolutely. And I think recently I've been going back to look at kind of China's last 200-300 years. Even if you look at the late Qing dynasty,
right,
there was Prince Gong, right, in the late Qing period, who met with Ulysses S. Grant, the first U.S. president, by then former president, who visited China. And Prince Gong asked Ulysses S. Grant to intervene on an issue with Japan, the Emperor of Japan, about the islands. There were the islands that Japan was looking to take over off the coast of, in between China and Japan, and the Chinese, and which had been an independent kingdom. And the Chinese court basically asked Qing government asked General Grant, President Grant, to talk to the Japanese about this. There they were dealing with a rising America as a rising great power in a period of decline of Britain, and where these new powers of Japan as a rising power, and where everyone was grappling towards new rules of the game. And the Qing court, of course, was also dealing with China in decline in that period. And so they were trying to figure out, what are the rules of the international game? These powers, these Western powers, talk to us about the, just war and things like this and the rules, but do they seem to operate according to them? And so back then, right, Ulysses Grant tried. He tried. Yes, he spoke to the Meiji Emperor, and they agreed to create a commission. But in the end, Japan took those islands over. and so China has this, and this is the unique thing about China, and I would say India. They have long historical memory.
Yes.
what it's like dealing with rise and fall of great powers, and and when they are in different positions.
Right.
China
Right.
was on the decline. Now China's on the rise.
It's
And and US is kind of in what position, I ask, right? So it's an interesting question, you know.
But I mean, you'll agree with me, right, that America, different from Holland and Britain, is a huge economy. I mean, we're not a tiny country, right? And so
That's
I don't expect America to disappear anytime soon. But it's
no,
just a question of how does one learn to live eyeball to eyeball with another power that is our size. But now let me put you on the spot, right? I mean, you keep saying North America. Well, North America includes this wonderful country that I dearly love called Canada, right? So, how does Canada, and more broadly, of course, I'm bringing this in because there's Australia, there's other countries in Asia. How does a Canada navigate between China and America, especially seeing the very old relationship between the US and Canada, the amount of trade between US and Canada? How does Canada do that? What is your thought?
that's a great question, Sowar. And that's a hotly debated topic in Canada these days. One school of thought, and the loudest school of thought currently, is, well, we got to get closer to the United States, or whatever the United States is asking, in this time of growing great power competition, because of Canada's, if shall we say, reliance or dependency on the United States economically, but also we have, long historical social ties, cultural ties, and of course, military. And so some people argue North American integration. That's the answer. You should just side with the Americans on whatever the Americans are saying. There's another school of thought, that Canada ultimately needs to maintain some degree, of relative autonomy, even though obviously Canada is in the structural conditions that it is, and the U.S. is our strongest friend and ally. At the same time, Canada needs to have diversification options, and in a world where the future of the world economy, the center of that appears to be shifting towards Asia. We need to be able to have other options as well. And so I think Canada right now is very much trapped in this great power competition where you have China on the one side and US on the other. China, of course, is our number 2 trading partner. US is by far, far and away our number 1 trading partner. What does this mean for Canada? And right now, the Canadian government hasn't been clear. I think it's almost maintained ambiguity as its approach, strategic ambiguity. There are opposition parties very loudly calling for Canada to confront China and to be very clear and, joining the Anglo Alliance. And there were questions about, well, why was Canada left out of the AUKUS, right, with Australia and UK and the US? I actually, in my personal view, I don't think that's such a bad thing. I think this is where the United States and those partners, obviously Canada's part of the Five Eyes network, so already we're there. But this is a situation where I think for Canada, one of the great challenges right now is even reading the United States, right? Where is the United States going? What does the Biden administration really want to do with China? At the start, it looked like the Biden administration was basically carrying over a lot of the Trump administration, kind of getting tough with China positioning. Now, as the Biden administration moves forward and deals with the global pandemic, health, and also climate change, they realize that they have to find ways to cooperate with China, even if they want to also compete with China. And the Biden administration is having to move a bit. And I think here, Canada, is trying to figure out where the United States is going to position. Like, how is the United States positioning on this?
Are you equally concerned that what America is trying to do is not understood even by such a close partner of America's as Canada is? What is the Gregory Chin approach that Canada should take?
So I think, yeah, absolutely. I think, we're all trying to figure out where the United States is going, and then of course we all look forward to 2024 as the next election and what that could mean. But, because we know the United States seems to be a fairly divided society right now, and kind of, more and more so. And so there are great concerns from the standpoint of Canada, right? And I think that, right now, I think my view on this is clearly we have our security alliance with the United States. Clearly, we have to maintain good relations with the United States. But my view is that Canada also needs to know when it should say yes to the United States request and when it has to say to the United States, as a friend, what you're asking is not putting us in a good position. And I think if we had thought about some of those things, including in the recent past, the last 3 years, dealing with the Huawei scenario and things like that, I think we needed to be much more strategic in our response to the United States on those requests.
So we're starting to get close to the witching hour, as they say. But I want to ask you, in the time we have left, so you, Gregory Chen, find yourself alone with Xi Jinping and Joseph Biden, and they give you a minute or two to say, advise us, what should we be focused on? And it's your chance to take a minute and tell both of them in private what concerns you.
I think the crux of the issue is that the entire world relies on the US and China to figure out some accommodation between them. And I think in that regard, you mentioned Henry Kissinger. I believe he's correct. The big challenge for the world moving forward is, can these two big civilizational states, and I think the United States is a civilizational state too, as far as its role in the Western world, can they coexist? Can they find ways? Can they figure out through honest conversation and negotiation, where are they going to jointly work together on climate, on environment, on health? In which areas are they going to compete more than cooperate? Technology, AI. If that's the case, where in those areas there's going to be less cooperation, what are the bridges between them so that we don't go into bipolar Cold War scenario again, right? And what would the bridges be between the two worlds in those areas where they're not working as closely? And how wide or narrow are those bridges?
So I'm going to put you on the spot. Make that into an action statement for them. Please, Presidents Biden and Xi Jinping, here's what I want you to do.
The world needs you to work more together on the global health pandemic, on global health challenges, global response to these global problems, also on climate change and health. And though we accept that you may be competing in the area of technology, we also need you to get together at the WTO or at a new bilateral summit or Yalta type summit to reach some accommodation on what will be the bridges of communication on technology, AI, digital moving forward, so that we don't end up in a Cold War type scenario.
Well, thank you, Professor Gregory Chin. We've run out of time, but this was a most educational interview, starting as it did after a bit of a technical brouhaha. So I want to thank you for your appearance. I hope we'll have you back again before too long on PolarisLive, but thank you very much for appearing.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Sowar. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say thank you for watching the program today. Please visit PolarisLive.com to get a listing of upcoming programs that remain in our autumn schedule. I do hope you'll subscribe to Polaris Live's channel on YouTube. There's no cost, but it really, really, really does help us. I hope you join us again next Tuesday. And until then,